When you're trying to work out why a volunteer is not performing, probably a good place to start is what's their motivation. What was their motivation for turning up? And why aren't they motivated now? And it might be you've got them in the cover stuff in the envelope to the fact they wanted to meet people and socialise. So, but the values function is the most common reason that people want. They want to give back to the community. Understanding, volunteers seeking to learn more about the world and or exercise skills. That's a common one. You know, people, especially for people who retire, what are they going to do? Well, I'm just an engineer, but maybe I can do something different. Learn more about the world. Exercise skills that are unused or haven't been used anymore because they retire. My husband fell into that category. He's never volunteered before. That's what I do for a living, but never volunteered before. And he retired, and I got sick of him after 2 years, so I found a volunteer job for him. But every time I'd go home, he'd say, so what time are you going to be home tonight? Because I live in Barrel, which is 120 km south of here. So I'd get home pretty late, and then I'd have a meeting. Hey, that token, come on in.
Thank you. Token.
So my husband was one of those, you know, well, I've renovated the house for 2 years now, what do I do? So I found him a volunteer job, which is really good because it's in the Solomon Islands, it's for 2 years. But he is so motivated now. He's just come home, he's going back tomorrow, and he's even bought some golf clubs to take back with him. I think, you might be staying for a while. So he wanted to use his skills. So that motivated him. Never done it before, but he was an engineer. He's an engineer. And his brain was going a million miles an hour around engineering things that had nothing to apply it for. So now he's in the Solomon Islands teaching the people over there how to make roads. Because they haven't got machinery or much machinery, so they needed someone who was old enough like him to remember how to make a road without a machine. So his skills were ideal for that job. So the next one, enhancement. People want to grow and develop psychologically through involvement in volunteering. We started to work with organisations who have people with mental disabilities as their clients, and try and get them engaged in volunteering as an entry back into the workforce or into the workforce for the first time. Across at the bottom, and it goes on right. Career. Now that is really common for young people. Am I in your way? No. Really common for young people. Straight out of university, want to do something, and it really does work. You know, if you had I volunteered for the last 3 months somewhere, it's going to maybe tick you over in terms of when they're comparing one applicant with another. Well, here's someone who's, you know, doesn't just sit around waiting. And we've had feedback where that has actually won people a job because they've done something positive in their life while they've been looking for jobs. So very, very common with young people. Very common too with people whose English is not their first language, because they want to get this language skills, learn about the work culture, and so volunteering is a good way to do that. So social function, well, it stands to reason, you know, like if people are suddenly giving up work or they're lonely and at home, volunteering is a great way to meet people, especially if it's an organisation that you have some sort of, you know, emotional attachment to, whether it's health, welfare, environment, animals, whatever. It's a good way to meet people who are like-minded. And protective function. Individual users volunteering to reduce negative feelings such as guilt or address personal problems. And all the times I've done assessments and using those 30-question tool that I mentioned, I'd say this is one of the least common. There's no way you can fudge it because the questions don't really give you any indication of what the outcome of your answer is going to be. But that's the least common. So, what's a suitable role for a volunteer? What can't a volunteer do? Give me some jobs a volunteer wouldn't be able to do.
Surgery.
Sorry?
Surgery.
Médecins sans frontières? Don't fall into the trap of thinking that we're talking about people with skills and where they can apply them, whether they're paid or unpaid. So that one is the most common. Oh, you can't be a doctor, you can't volunteer to be a doctor. Well, you can if you're a doctor. And you can't be a web designer either if you're not qualified to be a web designer. So think about the skill. So there's not anything a volunteer can't do and can't be trained to do or is not qualified to do. So every role suitable. problem is the organisation's got a finite amount of money and has to decide which ones are going to be paid jobs and which ones are going to be volunteer jobs. And that's sometimes where the tension occurs between staff and volunteers. One organisation that I did some training with were really quite cross. Every year their budget got cut and every year they got more volunteers. Now they blamed the volunteers for the budget cuts, when in fact the budget cuts were going to happen anyway. They didn't have to take the volunteers in, but they wanted to fulfil their obligation to the community despite the cuts in funding. So they took the volunteers in and then they blamed them for getting the cuts in funding. It's really up to the organisation to decide where the cut-off is and how they spend their money. So there's no particular role that's appropriate. It's a priority of the board or the management committee to decide where the money's going to be spent. And when they get to the point where there's no more money left, then they have to decide, well, do we stop working at this level or do we continue working and engage volunteers to help us? So it's very much a philosophical decision as well as a pragmatic one about, money and people, etc. So any role suitable, it's up to the organisation to make a determination about which ones are going to be volunteer and which ones are going to be paid. So job descriptions. You all know the national standards. Yes? I hope you've all got a copy in the shelf somewhere. And they give you a really good benchmark about the level at which you're operating. And I would say most organisations are probably 95–99% in sync with the standards. But there should be job descriptions for volunteers. And I've got a sample one here, very simple one. It could be 2 lines, the task description. It doesn't have to be complicated. I think the public service now are about 25 pages long, aren't they, job descriptions, and all the do's, don'ts, must-haves, must-nots, can do, can't do, sort of stuff. That all sits separately, I think, from the job description. It's about codes of conduct and confidentiality and privacy, all those sorts of things. So job descriptions, most necessary and a good starting point. So designing a job description, think outside the box. When I do training for large organisations, I ask them to think about the thing they want done in the organisation that's not being done right now. And they will get things like barista, massages. I said, yeah, well that's fine, but you're not likely to get approval to have those filled. Think of something that you need to do in the organisation that you want done now. And this particular organisation, which is a statewide organisation I went to, I got them to write their job descriptions on butcher's paper, gave them some parameters like what they had to consider, including the national standards. And because they were one organisation, they all had similar positions all around the state. They all got their cameras or their phones and went around photographing all of the job descriptions and then all went back and wrote them out and advertised them. So that their planning for the next year was virtually done in one training session. So some of them hadn't thought about the jobs that other groups had said, oh, look, we need this, and someone said, oh, that's a good idea. And they said, look, we just don't have time to manage volunteers. This just takes up too much time. So I said, well, get a volunteer manager. No, the department will not allow us to have a volunteer manager. We can't employ someone to manage, we can't engage someone to manage volunteers if they're volunteer. I said, why not? And they said, I don't know, they're just not allowed to have. I said, so can you call them an administration assistant and then get them to manage the volunteers? So they just changed the word title, kept the same job description, and then they got their volunteer manager. They just didn't call it that. So think outside the box. Don't take no for an answer. And remember that they are the workforce, so when we're engaging volunteers, they should be part of the plan, the strategic plan of the organisation. They should be considered in terms of how they're going to help us deliver what we need to deliver, in terms of our funding agreement, our commitment to the community, etc. And they should have value, should add value. I still get organisations ringing and saying that they just take anybody. And there was a big argument at a meeting I was at recently where one group just said, oh no, we just take everybody that comes in. And I said, well, how demeaning is that? You know, if you've got a PhD student and a truck driver, and you're telling them their roles are not different because you don't even know what you're going to offer them. Why would you have the truck driver doing research if that's not his interest? He wants to be a community bus driver, for instance. So when you're taking volunteers, you have to think about the value that person's going to add, and that's why the job description is so important. you just take in everybody. There's one organisation that came to training and they said, oh, we don't have to worry about advertising for volunteers, we've got a 4-year waiting list. And I said, a 4-year waiting list? She said, yes. I said, why? She said, oh, people just come and say they want to volunteer for us, so we just put them on the list. And I said, well, that's a bit of an insult, isn't it? What if they get there after 4 years and you decide they haven't got anything to offer you? Oh. She said, I think that's an insult to have people dangling for 4 years when you don't even know if you're going to give them a job. I said, go home, toss your list out the window and just put a sign up that says, when we need volunteers, we will advertise. And then advertise when you need them. Just don't keep sweeping them in because it's not very respectful of them and their time and just the fact that they've offered to help you out. And you haven't even got the courage to say, sorry, we don't need you. And it takes courage sometimes because you think, oh, well, we're giving their time for nothing. It'd be awful if I just said no. Say no, if you don't need them. Then they can go and find something to do somewhere else. So remember, time limit, 16 hours a week on a regular basis, if that's the national standards. If it's a short-term engagement, you can stretch that out to more hours a week, but if it's ongoing, remember duty of care, stress is one of the most common reasons that people end up having work cover claims. Good luck to the volunteer trying to get one though. Skills, knowledge, expertise required, volunteer motivations. You won't have to slide a 30 questionnaire under their nose, but it might pay to ask them, why do you want to come and work for Doggy Rescue? Oh, I just love playing with dogs. Well, actually we need an administration assistant. So find out what their motivations are, because if they want to play with the dogs and you haven't got a dog playing job, they might lose interest and drift off. Performance standards, of course, and organisational volunteer policy. Now that's another question I often get rung up about. We've got our HR policies in place and now we're finally, after 27 years, getting around to our volunteer policy. Have you got any? Yes, I say. Have you got any HR policies? Yes, I say. I said, how about adding the word volunteer and you're done? Why would you manage your volunteers differently to your paid staff? Why would you? I can't think of a reason other than the pay scale. Because if they're performing for the organisation, delivering services at the same level and standard as paid staff, why would you want them to have less knowledge, less awareness about the organisation and less rights?